this talk is called How I Deal with Depression. And so it's a 20-minute talk, and the goal is to provide some concrete things to do and maybe a slightly different perspective focused at data folks, right? So the idea is that the people here are focused on data, and I think that can be a really helpful way to ground how you might deal with anxiety or depression or something like that. Real quick about me, I work as a Power BI consultant. I make training videos on Pluralsight, but the important part is I'm self-employed, which means I can talk about this stuff and no one can fire me. As long as I avoid like slurs or anything, or getting drunk and going on Twitter, I generally am fine. And so over time, I've decided to start talking about this stuff more because there were 3 things that I was scared would get me fired at my last job. Diabetes, because in the US our healthcare system's not the best and I'm expensive to keep around. Depression, because I was worried that my boss might think I couldn't do my job. And LARPing, because it looks kind of weird when you're hitting each other with foam swords in the woods. So, so what are we going to talk about today? Today, I want to take a 3-step approach to help everyone here, because there's going to be a number of people here who either don't have depression but know someone who does, or are in denial about being in depression, right? Because I think the English language does a disservice. So I'm going to try and help you feel it or get an idea of what it might feel like if it's not something you experience. This isn't intended on being a downer, but more that I want to help communicate that there's a lot of cognitive distortions associated with clinical depression that's more than just normal sadness. I'm going to talk about how you could potentially track it. There's a number of different things you can do. Some of them take 5 minutes and are very simple. Some are tactile. And then how you can treat it. So a number of different things that you can do to improve your lifestyle and to potentially help. Quick content warning. So one, there's some evocative photography from when I was in college, so you may see some emotions on screen. I may reference some negative self-talk. There's plenty of times where I think, oh, I'm a loser, I'm an idiot, over something tiny. And then you might see a grown man crying on stage, but I've given this talk a handful of times, so the risk is minimized. But in case that upsets you, I was raised German, so I understand some people here may be uncomfortable with seeing that, but that's the content. Also, really quick, if you're considering suicide, this is the UK National Helpline, and if you are in an abusive relationship, this is the UK resource website. Sometimes depression is totally valid because you're in an unsafe situation. Your mileage will vary. I am not a doctor, I am not a psychologist, I am some schmuck who decided that I'm willing to talk about my struggles on stage, and so some of these things may work for you, some of them may not. That said, from talking to people who've attended before, some of these ideas and things were novel for them, or at least helped provide a framework. So, for me personally, I've dealt with depression since college. When I was a child and a teenager, I had a very strong family network. So basically, I was raised by my dad and my grandparents. I grew up with my sister. And so for me personally, I was always around people. I always had familial support. And then in college, there was a lot of stress from that, but people started moving away. My aunts and uncles wouldn't visit as much, and my grandparents started to pass away. And so it was that time that I was dealing with thoughts and feelings that I'd never experienced before. I do a number of things to treat it. So I am a diabetic. I have to take medicine every day. I have to check my blood sugar every day, right? And so for me right now, depression is much more like diabetes. It's a daily maintenance issue as opposed to, okay, something that I hope to get cured. I do hope to get it cured. My score we'll talk about later is the best it's been in years. 2024 is looking pretty good for me, but I have not solved it. So you don't need to worry about some snake oil that I'm going to sell you, this one weird trick. I have like 12 really weird tricks, and some of them help a little bit, and maybe one will help you. And like I said, I still struggle with it today. So what does depression feel like? Because I think this is one of the biggest hurdles if you want to help someone or you want to get a handle on it yourself. Because again, the English language does us a disservice. There is a mile-wide or kilometer-wide gap between being sad about something or even healthy grieving and what clinical depression feels like from the inside. So it's kind of hard to see on here. This is what grieving feels like. Grieving is a natural, normal, healthy part of the human condition. So this was some photography I took in college whenever my grandfather passed away. I was sad, but that sadness represented a human connection that I had to that person. That was uncomfortable, but it was healthy. Depression, however, looks a lot more like this. It's Freud mistakenly described it as internalized anger, right? And while that's not accurate of depression, it can feel that way sometimes because there's often a lot of self-criticality, self-unkindness involved, right? And so outwardly you feel sad and down, but inwardly you might be very unkind or critical of yourself. And specifically, I posted this on Facebook a decade ago. Don't mind the Spanish. Sometimes I change the language to practice. And there's something particular with this, because I was surprised with how many people it resonated with. At the time, I had this continual irrational thought that I was an evil person. It was bugging the hell out of me because I couldn't convince myself out of it. And that's something really, really important to get. Everyone here is very, very smart. You get paid to use your brain. And mental health issues are often one of those areas where your most valuable asset is turned against you. And if you try to think your way out of it, you're likely to fail, as tempting as that is. So again, depression feels like continual, irrational thoughts that you can't convince yourself your way out of. There are thought-based treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy, which we'll talk about briefly, but the key thing is, it's like being in quicksand. Thrashing your way out isn't going to work. And specifically, like I said, don't expect to outthink this. A lot of times, just trying harder doesn't help. So that's what depression feels like. Let's talk about some frameworks and some structure to explain a little bit more about what's going on. So it's very tempting to be like, well, it's this foggy idea of just being kind of sad, kind of down. In reality, though, there's three horsemen of depression that are very, very common. First is feeling helpless. So it's the three lesses. It's feeling helpless, like you can't change your circumstances, you can't do anything. It's also feeling hopeless, that it'll never change. But most importantly, it's feeling worthless, right? If you're dealing with all three of these, then there's a very good sign that you're dealing with clinical depression and not just a rough time or just some sort of sadness, right? It's very common to see these. And so depression is very much like a wobbly cart. I'm sure all of us have gone to the grocer and we've gotten a cart and we've gotten the one that someone else left there. And it just drifts off to the left just a little bit, right? And if you keep your hands on it, it's fine. But the moment you let loose, it eventually just slams into one of the aisles, right? And so depression can be a lot that way where you feel like, okay, as long as I can keep my hands on that, it's fine. But there's a bias. If you've ever worked with machine learning, you understand the idea of bias, right? Where your predictive outputs are just a little bit off in one direction or another. Specifically, there's three types of biases referred to as explanatory style, right? So you can imagine a situation where my friend Daniel Hootmacher walks by, doesn't say hello, and I think, oh, he hates me, I'm a jerk, I'm a terrible person, what is he thinking? He's probably mad at me about something I said on the internet. And that's an explanatory style. The first one is personal, that it's about me. Maybe he's just distracted. Maybe he's jet lagged. Maybe he didn't even see me. But I take those inputs, and there's a bias towards saying it's about me. It's my fault. I'm a bad person. I've done something wrong. Next is pervasive. This negativity is all of life, right? And so this would be a common thing where, sometimes I do screw things up. I changed my mom's debit card, and I didn't tell my aunt who handles her groceries. And so it's really easy to go, oh, well, I made a mistake here as a son, so therefore all of me is bad, right? The idea that all of my life is bad or whatever. And then finally, permanent. So these three Ps. Permanent, the idea is like it's never going to get better, it's never going to go away. So when you're dealing with depression, it's very, very hard to trust your subjective inputs because that cart keeps hitting into the grocery aisle because you keep thinking, oh, it's all about me, it's never going to change, and all of my life is awful or everything I do is wrong, right? A lot of all or nothing talk. So how do you deal with this, right? Again, the audience here is generally data-oriented. And one of the things that can be most helpful is to start collecting some data. And there can be a couple different reasons why you might want to do this. So one is it's validating, right? Because one of the things that they find with people who are dealing with depression or other mental health issues, depending on which one, is that your frame of reference gets narrowed, right? You're miserable right now, and you kind of like retcon the story of your life that you've always been miserable, right? And so collecting data can be helpful to say, oh, I really am miserable right now, or you know what, I did actually have fun going to SQLBits, and maybe, just maybe, this is something temporary that I'm dealing with. So one way to do that, I don't have the link on here, but there's an app called Dalio, D-A-L-I-O. And for 2 years, I was almost daily tracking my mood, right? Every day I'd get 1 of 5 smiley faces and say, okay, I'm green or yellow was great, and then green was pretty good, and then the gray at the right was just awful, right? And you can then chart that, and it's kind of hard to tell, but 2021 was way, way better than 2020. Now, do we know, was there anything going on in 2020? I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader, right? But you can actually see this. And even better, I was able to notice patterns. It wasn't until I did this talk that I noticed that I had a weird monthly cycle, right? And that monthly cycle, my best theory is I'm self-employed, and customers pay every month a lot of times. And so I think a lot of that was just my financial condition going up and down. But I was also able to tie it to specific life events, right? Because there were certain times where it just plummeted or shot up. One of them, my mom got diagnosed with benign breast cancer. She's fine now. It was routine surgery. Everything's fine. But I was a mess for about a week or two, right? And I could see it in the numbers. And that was personally grounding and validating to be like, oh, it's not just in my head. I really am going through a difficult time. Another one is the US election. I'm not going to get into politics, but I think a lot of people in a lot of places were stressed out about it. No matter what side of the aisle you were on, there was a lot of uncertainty. And so right before the US election of 2020, I was a mess because I didn't know what was going to happen. And then finally, when I got vaccinated, you can see my mood just shot through the roof. I was like, all right, I can leave my cave, I can go out, see some sunshine, all this kind of stuff. And the only reason I was able to find out these patterns is because I recorded this information, and then I did a presentation. I don't recommend that part. You can probably just chart it yourself in Excel, but you have options. Another way that you can track it is a weekly self-assessment. So there's a couple of different ones. I went ahead and did the Burns Depression checklist, and I scored a 10, which is probably the best I've been in a while. I'm normal but unhappy. I'll take that. I'll put that on a t-shirt, right? The last time I gave this talk was in November for Past Summit, and I was a 19, right? So big improvement. 2024 is looking great. I will take normal but unhappy. And this is something that you might do, say, weekly, maybe even less, but the key thing is there have been times where I've been in like the 20s, 25, that sort of thing. And it's so validating to be like, oh, I am a mess. And it helps me be like, you know what, I can't ignore this. I need to treat this as if I have a broken leg or an impairment or something like that, right? Finally, sometimes I use a little tally counter. You can buy them for like $5 at like Walmart or Amazon. And I would put on the calendar how many negative thoughts I had that day, right? And I could tell, okay, if I've slept poorly, it would double. But even just tracking it caused it to go down because I had more awareness of those negative thoughts, right? And what was causing them. All right, so we've got just a couple minutes left, so let's talk about treating it. There's really 2 approaches to think about. There's clinical or personal kind of treatments, and then there's lifestyle changes, right? So you can either take certain treatments or you can change your lifestyle. For treatments, Cognitive behavioral therapy is currently the gold standard of therapy. And I won't get into it too much, but basically it's the idea that you can widen the gap between stimulus and response and notice that you are thinking out of balance with the world in that biased kind of mode, and you can address that. Meditation for certain people can be helpful to have more of a bottom-up approach. So instead of noticing the thoughts and trying to change your thinking, you're improving your awareness and working from the bottom up. I recommend both, honestly. Sometimes talk therapy can help. Sometimes you're just in a difficult life space, right? There isn't anything that's an issue with you, but it can be helpful to be like, oh, I need to change my life circumstances, or I need to be able to vent to someone. And then personally, I take antidepressants, so I take 20 milligrams of Lexapro. I would like to go down, but for me personally, that sine wave of mood up and down, it clipped off the bottom. It made the lows not as low. It didn't solve it. It didn't make me happier. It just made it so that the worst times weren't nearly so bad. Lifestyle changes really quickly. Sleep. Get sleep. Go to bed. Again, whenever you track this, I would have twice as many negative thoughts in a day when I had poor sleep. I had empirical evidence, and I think you'll be able to find the same. I suffer from seasonal affective disorder. I need sunshine. We've learned in the winter, we have to ship me somewhere warm. So this year it was Puerto Rico, but we in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, compete with Seattle for cloudy days. I hear it's not much better here in the UK. So get some sunshine. You can buy a sun lamp to simulate sunshine. Social support is a huge, huge one. We are social creatures. Exercise, probably better than any antidepressant you can buy in the market, is exercise. You may not want to do it, but it has huge, huge impacts. And then finally, building habits, right? So one of the things I'm trying to do right now is first thing in the morning, I get on the exercise bike, and I play video games, and I have my little sun lamp. And because I've made it a habit, it's much more natural, which is helpful because when you're dealing with depression, doing anything is hard. Activation of doing stuff is difficult, and you can lower that activation cost with building habits. All right, finally, last 2 minutes, happy to talk after to anyone. Some recommended reading, some books that have helped me. The first one is Feeling Good by David Burns. Go buy this today. It was written, I want to say, in the 80s. Some of it may be a bit dated, but this is the best book I've ever seen on cognitive behavioral therapy. It will immensely help you, and they've done studies to show that it can be helpful. 10% Happier by Dan Harris. He's a news anchor. Probably one of the best books I've seen on mindfulness meditation. So if you want at least a funny intro, because he was a war correspondent, did drugs, and then decided that meditation was a better choice, it's an entertaining read even if you don't take any of that. The Cognitive Behavioral Workbook is a great workbook, again, focused on cognitive behavioral therapy. The Upward Spiral is nice if you want some of the neuroscience behind some of these things. Overcoming Depression is more of a touchy-feely sort of thing, but if you are needing more compassion towards yourself, I think it'd be really helpful. And then finally, Rewire Your Anxious Brain. If you're suffering from anxiety, this was really helpful to understand that there's two parts of the brain that cause anxiety. There's the prefrontal cortex that worries and the amygdala that is fearful. And that's it. I'd appreciate any feedback, but thank you for your time, everyone.